Thousands of years before the first Bible was written, before the pyramids of Egypt stood against the desert sky, before any religion, as we know it, had a name, a group of people living between two rivers in what is now southern Iraq sat down and pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. They were not making grocery lists. They were not recording. Taxes. They were trying to answer the one question that has haunted every human being who has ever drawn breath. What happens when we die? And what they wrote down was not a comforting promise of heaven or a warning about hell. What they wrote was something far stranger, far older, and in many ways far more disturbing than anything that came after it. The Sumerians were the first. That is not an exaggeration. They built the first cities. They invented the first writing system. They kept the first records of law, medicine, astronomy, and myth. And buried within the tens of thousands of clay tablets they left behind, there is a cosmology of death that scholars have spent over a century translating, debating, and struggling to fully understand. Some of what those tablets describe has worked its way into modern folklore, into viral videos, into breathless YouTube titles that promise to reveal what the ancient Sumerians knew about the light you see when you die. But to actually understand what is in those tablets, you have to go back further than the headlines. You have to go back to the clay itself. The Sumerian underworld had a name. It was called Kur. The word itself is ancient beyond reckoning, and it carried multiple meanings inside the Sumerian language. It meant mountain, it meant foreign land, and it meant the place beneath the earth where the dead go. These three meanings were not accidental. To the Sumerians, the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead was something like the boundary between the familiar and the utterly unknown, a mountain range on the horizon, a territory you could see but never quite reach, a place that existed at the very edge of the world, beyond the last village, beyond the last tree, beneath the very ground you walked on every day of your life. Kur was not a place of reward or punishment. That idea came much later with other civilizations and other religions. In the earliest Sumerian texts, Kur received everyone equally, the king and the slave, the priest and the criminal, the mother who died in childbirth and the soldier who died on the battlefield. Every single human soul walked the same road after death, and that road did not lead somewhere bright. The text described Kur as a house of dust and darkness, a place where the dead eat clay and drink mud, where they wear feathers instead of clothes and wander in a gray, lightless expanse that goes on forever in all directions. There is no sun in Kur. There is no wind. The air is thick and still and tastes like old earth. The dead do not speak to one. Another in the way the living speak. They exist in a kind of diminished half-life, a shadow of what they were, slowly forgetting who they had been and what they had done and who they had loved. This is important to hold on to, because when the viral content about Sumerian tablets and the light after death started spreading across TikTok and YouTube in recent weeks, it described something that sounds almost nothing like this. It described the light as a machine. It described it as a trap. It described ancient Sumerian gods deliberately constructing a kind of spiritual recycling system designed to catch the souls of the dead and pull them back into another body against their will. The framing was dramatic and seductive and, to be completely honest, almost entirely modern. The ideas being attributed to the Sumerians are real ideas, but they come from Gnostic philosophy, from 2nd and 3rd century CE mystical texts, not from the cuneiform tablets pressed into clay 4,000 years before that. The conflation is not always malicious. Sometimes it is simply the product of the internet's need to make ancient history feel like a puzzle that, once solved, will reveal a secret someone has been hiding from you. But here's the thing. The actual Sumerian tablets are strange enough on their own. You do not need to add a soul machine or a forced reincarnation trap to make them remarkable. What the Sumerians actually believed about death, about the journey of the soul, about the structure of the cosmos beyond the boundary of life, is one of the most extraordinary and haunting things that any human civilization has ever written down. And it begins with a goddess who decided, for reasons the texts never fully explain, to abandon everything she had and walk down into the darkness. Her name was Inana. She was the queen of heaven. She ruled over love and war, over grain and rainfall, over the great above. She was the most powerful deity in the Sumerian pantheon, worshipped in temple complexes that stretched across the ancient cities of Uruk and Nippur and Ur. And one day, she decided to descend into Kur. She gave up her temples. She gave up her throne. She put on her 7 divine garments, the symbols of her power and her rank and her identity, and she walked toward the entrance of the underworld in the Zagros Mountains to the east, in the place where the earth swallows the sun every evening. The text that describes this journey is one of the oldest and most complete pieces of literature in human history. It was assembled from over 50 separate clay tablets discovered at excavation sites across Iraq from the late 1800s onward. Scholars spent decades piecing it together like a broken mosaic. The authoritative English translation was finally published by the University of Oxford in 2001 through a project called the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, which gathered and translated the oldest writings in the world and made them freely available online. The text runs to approximately 400 lines, and it begins with one of the most resonant sentences ever written in any language. From the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven, the goddess set her mind on the great below. That repetition was deliberate. The Sumerians loved it. They used it the way a musician uses rhythm, to make you feel the weight of what was happening, the enormity of the choice Inanna was making. She was not falling into darkness. She was choosing it. She was walking toward it with her eyes open and her reasons her own. Before she left, she gave careful instructions to her servant Ninshubur. She said, "If I am not back in 3 days, go to the gods. Go to Enlil, the god of air and storms. Go to Nana, the moon god. And if they will not help you, go to Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who knows the secret of life. Tell them what happened to me. Do not let me die in the underworld." Then she walked to the gate of Kur and knocked. The gatekeeper's name was Neti, and Neti went inside to ask Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld and Inanna's own older sister, what to do with this unexpected visitor. Ereshkigal's response was cold and precise. She said, "Let her in, but follow the ancient rites. At each of the 7 gates she must be stripped. When Inanna asks why, tell her it is the custom of the underworld. Tell her she must not question it." And so the stripping began. At the first gate, Neti took Inanna's crown from her head. At the second gate, her earrings. At the third, her necklace of precious stones. At the fourth, the breastplate she wore over her heart. At the fifth, her golden ring. At the sixth, her measuring rod and line. And at the 7th gate, the final gate, he took her royal robe, the single garment she had left, the last protection between her divinity and the absolute nakedness of death. She entered Kur with nothing. She entered it as nothing. The 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki, looked at her. Their gaze alone was the look of death, and Ereshkigal pronounced her guilty of arrogance, of walking into a place where the living do not belong. Inanna was struck dead, and her corpse was hung on a hook on the wall of the underworld, where it began to rot. 3 days passed. Ninshubur did exactly as she had been told. She went to Enlil. He refused to help. She went to Nana. He also refused. She went to Enki, and Enki listened. He did not refuse. He fashioned 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, beings that were neither male nor female, beings so small and so strange that the underworld would not recognize them as intruders. He gave them the food of life and the water of life, and he sent them to Kur with a task. Find Ereshkigal. Listen to her. When she cries out in pain, cry with her. When she mourns, mourn beside her. And when she offers you gifts, ask only for Inanna's corpse. This is one of the most psychologically sophisticated moments in all of ancient literature. Enki did not send warriors. He did not send another god. He sent empathy. He sent the act of bearing witness to another's suffering. And it worked. Ereshkigal was moved. She gave them what they asked for. They sprinkled the food of life and the water of life on Inanna's body 3 times, and she rose from the dead. But the underworld does not give things for free. The gala, the dark attendants of Kur, followed Inanna back to the surface. They told her, "Someone must take your place. You cannot return from the land of no return without leaving a substitute behind." Inanna chose her husband Dumuzi, who had not mourned her death and had been sitting on his throne eating and drinking while she rotted in the underworld, and Dumuzi descended in her place. But his sister Geshtinana loved him so deeply that she offered to share his punishment, and so they agreed that Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld and Geshtinana would spend the other half. And that, the Sumerians believed, was why the earth goes barren in some seasons and blooms in others. It was the footstep of grief echoing through the world every year without end. This myth, this single poem preserved on clay for 4,000 years, tells us more about Sumerian beliefs about death than any amount of modern speculation could. It tells us that the underworld is real and permanent and ruled by a grief that even the gods cannot escape. It tells us that coming back from death is possible, but costs something enormous. It tells us that the boundary between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a gate, and that gates can sometimes be opened from both sides, but only if you know who to ask and what to offer. There is also something in the poem that connects directly to the viral content about the light after death, though not in the way most people present it. The 7 gates of the underworld, through which Inanna is stripped piece by piece of everything that makes her who she is, have been interpreted by many scholars as a representation of the process of dying itself. The dying person, in Sumerian cosmology, does not simply blink out of existence. They are unmade, gradually. Each piece of their identity, their status, their beauty, their power, their memories, is taken from them one at a time, until there is nothing left but the bare fact of their having existed at all. The stripping is not punishment. It is transformation. It is what death does. Now, where does the light come in? And this is where the story takes one of its most unexpected turns, because buried inside the Sumerian texts, there is something that no viral video quite captures in its full strangeness. the idea of a god who does not belong to the world of the dead, and yet passes through it every single night without fail. In Sumerian cosmology, there was a god named Utu. In Akkadian, he was called Shamash. He was the sun god, and his role in the universe was more complex than simply making the days warm. Every morning, Utu rose from a mountain in the east and drove his chariot across the sky. Every evening, he descended below the horizon and entered the underworld, passing through it in the darkness, and emerged from another mountain in the east when dawn came again. He was the light that moved through the land of the dead every single night. The Akkadian texts describe him with an epithet that has never lost its power: the son of the dead souls. He was the light that the dead could see but never touch, never hold, never follow back to the surface. He passed through the underworld like a reminder of what the living world felt like. And in his nightly passage, he also served as a judge. Some texts describe him sitting alongside the Anunnaki, the great judges, dispensing a form of cosmic justice in the dark. There are also references to a garden that Utu kept within the underworld, a garden where the trees bore fruit made of precious gems, rubies, and lapis lazuli, growing on branches in the deepest darkness, lit by his presence alone. When you understand this, the viral claim that the Sumerians described a light after death built by a specific entity suddenly snaps into a different kind of focus. There is a light. There's an entity connected to it, and that entity does travel through the world of the dead on a regular schedule. But the texts do not describe this light as a trap. They do not describe it as a machine designed to deceive. They describe it as the sun on its ancient path, performing its duty with the same indifference to human desire that the sun has always performed it. The light in the Sumerian underworld is not a lure. It is simply the sun, doing what the sun has always done, moving through every darkness it encounters on its way back to morning. The question of who built that light, who constructed the sun and set it on its path, leads deeper into Sumerian cosmology than most people ever go. In the beginning, according to the Sumerian creation accounts, there was the primordial sea. Her name was Namu. She was the water that existed. Before everything else, before sky and earth had separated, before light had been distinguished from darkness. From Namu came An, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess. From their union came Enlil, the great god of the air and storms, who separated them and filled the space between sky and earth with wind and breath and the possibility of life. The sun, in this cosmology, did not exist in the beginning. It was made. It was fashioned by the gods who came after the primordial waters, set in its place as part of the great ordering of the cosmos. When the Sumerians looked up at the sky and saw the sun, they were not looking at something eternal and uncreated. They were looking at something that had been built with purpose and intention to perform a specific task, to mark the days, to bring warmth to the crops, to light the way for the living, and every night to carry that light down through the gates of the underworld and illuminate, for a few hours in the darkness, the faces of the dead. This is the answer that the actual Sumerian tablets give to the question of who built the light you see after death. Not an alien intelligence, not a soul trap architect, not a conspiracy. The light was built by the same forces that built everything else, by the gods of the first water, by the sky and the earth in their ancient union, by Enlil and Enki and the great assembly of divine beings who ordered the cosmos and set each part of it in its place. The sun was their creation, and it belongs equally to the living and the dead. What the Sumerians also knew, and this is perhaps the part of their cosmology that deserves the most attention right now, in this moment, when so many people are reaching back into ancient texts looking for some secret that modern religion has forgotten to tell them, is that the dead are not passive. They are not simply gone. They are stills, present in the world in a way that cannot be entirely accounted for by biology or theology or physics. The dead require attention. They require libations, poured through clay pipes into the earth. They require descendants who remember their names. They require the living to hold them in mind, because the moment the living forget them, something in the underworld dims. The dead become hungrier. The boundary between the worlds grows thinner and more dangerous. This is not superstition. Or rather, it is superstition in the oldest and truest sense of that word, which is not foolishness, but a standing above, a looking over, a watching carefully for the signs that the world you cannot see is still in relationship with the world you can. The Sumerians watched carefully. They built that watching into their calendar, their rituals, their stories. They built it into the architecture of their grief. The Gilgamesh epic, which most people know as the great Sumerian poem about the search for immortality, contains a passage in which Gilgamesh calls up the ghost of his dead friend Enkidu and asks him what the underworld is like. Enkidu's answer is one of the bleakest and most honest things in ancient literature. He says that the worm eats the dead, that their bodies are full of dust and clay. He says that the only ones who are comfortable in the underworld are those who had many sons and daughters in life, because their children are there with them and because the offerings the children make still reach them. And he says that the worst fate in the underworld belongs to those who had no one. no children, no family, no one to remember them. They cannot even eat the scraps that fall from a feast. They eat nothing at all. This is the deepest teaching of the Sumerian tablets on the subject of death. Not that there is a light, not that the light is a trap or a machine or a conspiracy. The deepest teaching is about what you build while you are alive, who you bring into the world, who you care for, who you teach to remember you. Because the Sumerians believed, with a conviction that they pressed into clay and baked hard enough to survive 4,000 years, that the dead go somewhere real, and that what they find when they get there depends on what the living do after they're gone. The Anunnaki, who appear in the viral content as architects of a soul trap, were in the actual texts the great judges of the underworld. They were ancient gods, older even than the Sumerian civilization itself, who had been assigned to the underworld as their domain. In some texts there are 7 of them, in others there are more. They sit in assembly and they decide the fate of the dead, not in the way a modern court decides guilt or innocence, but in the way a council of ancient powers might decree the nature of reality. Their judgment was not moral in the modern sense. It was cosmological. It was about the order of things, about who belonged where and why. Nergal, the god of war and plague, who later married Ereshkigal and became co-ruler of Kur, entered the underworld through his own violent story. He was called to the underworld as a punishment for insulting Ereshkigal's representative at a divine feast, and when he arrived, rather than submitting to her judgment, he seized her by the hair and threatened to cut off her head. She wept. She made him an offer. She said, "Be my husband, be the lord of the underworld, sit beside me on my throne, and let me give you power over everything that lives and dies." And Nergal let go. He stayed. Love or conquest or something between the two bound together, the king of death and the queen of death in the darkest place in existence, and between them they ruled over everyone who ever died. This is the world the Sumerians built on their clay tablets. It is not a world that required machines or traps or ancient alien engineers to make it strange. It is strange because it is true to something deep in human experience. The feeling that death is a place with its own geography, its own rulers, its own politics and laws and traditions. The feeling that the dead are not simply gone, but gone somewhere, and that the place they have gone to is dark and cold and keeps its own counsel. The tablets do not tell you to avoid the light after death. They do not tell you that the light is an illusion designed to recycle your soul. Those ideas come from other traditions, other centuries, other anxieties. What the tablets tell you is something harder and in some ways more comforting. They tell you that the world of the dead is real, that it has rules, that there are beings who govern it and beings who love enough to descend into it after you, that the sun passes through it every night and carries its warmth even into the darkest place in existence, and that what you do in life, how you treat others, what you build, who you love, who you leave behind to remember you, matters. It echoes. It follows you. The Sumerian tablets are not a conspiracy. They are not a coded message waiting for a modern audience to decode. They are something rarer and more valuable than that. They are a record of the first time human beings sat down together and tried, with nothing but language and clay and firelight, to make sense of the thing that frightens us most. And what they made was not a simple answer. What they made was a story, and like all great stories, it does not resolve. It expands. It opens into more darkness and more wonder the longer you sit with it. It asks you to think about what you are leaving behind, about who will pour water into your grave, about whether the sun that crosses the sky above you now will cross the sky below you when you are gone. The Sumerians believed it would. They believed the sun made that passage every night, down through the 7 gates, through the house of dust, through the garden of gemstone trees, past the throne where Ereshkigal and Nergal sat in permanent winter, and out the other side before dawn. Night was not the absence of light. Night was light in transit through a world you could not see. And maybe that, more than any soul machine or ancient conspiracy, is the idea worth carrying out of these 4,000-year-old clay tablets, that the light keeps moving even when you cannot see it, that the darkness has its own structure and its own rulers and its own strange mercy, that someone, somewhere, even now, is being sent back from the dead by a god who decided that the only tool powerful enough to undo death was the willingness to sit beside grief and not look away. The Sumerians pressed that story into wet clay with a stick. It dried. It survived. It is still here. And whatever the light after death turns out to be, whoever or whatever built it, and for what purpose, the Sumerians were the first ones brave enough to ask the question. They were the first to point to the darkness on the horizon, the darkness where the sun disappears every evening, and say, there is something there, there is a place, and it has been waiting for us since the beginning of the world, long before your religion named it, long before any prophet or priest or philosopher tried to map it. The people of the first rivers looked into the dark and chose not to look away. They pressed their hands into clay and they made something that survived, not because they had the answer, but because they had the courage to keep asking. There is one more thing the tablets teach, and it may be the most quietly radical thing about them. In almost every religious system that followed the Sumerians, In Egypt and Greece and the Abrahamic faiths, death is presented as a problem that the right belief or the right ritual or the right relationship with the divine can solve. The right prayer, the right incantation, the right burial rite, the right baptism, the right last words. These are offered as keys that can unlock something better on the other side. The Sumerians were not naive enough to believe that. Their underworld did not care what you believed. It cared what you did, and more specifically, it cared what those who loved you did after you were gone. In that way, Sumerian theology was less about the individual and more about the community. It was not your personal faith that determined your fate in the underworld. It was the faithfulness of your children, your friends, your neighbors who remembered to pour water into the earth and speak your name aloud so that the sound of it could reach you in the dark. You could not save yourself from Kur, but you could be saved by love, by the specific, concrete, material act of someone who knew you choosing not to forget. That is what the ancient tablets are really about. When you strip away the sensational framing and the viral headlines and the soul machine mythology and sit with the actual words that human beings pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. They are about the terrible and beautiful fact that we need each other not just in life but after it. That the light that reaches the dead is not built by gods or aliens or cosmic machinery. It is built by the living. It is built by grief that refuses to become silence. It is built every time someone says a name that the world has otherwise stopped saying. That is the light the Sumerians described. That is who built it. And that, if you're listening, is why.